right, we've talked about how we can conduct our audit. Now let's talk about gathering evidence. Remember how I said when we are auditing, if we are going to provide a report and say these things are out of compliance with company policy, regulation, or what you expect or what you're trying to do, we have to have evidence that shows, that proves that this is the case. And we gather the evidence so that we can substantiate what our final assessment is. So when we talk about gathering evidence, there are actually a number of ways to gather evidence. And we can see here that evidence can be gathered just by watching, just by observing, by talking to people and the notes from our interview, by looking at the documentation itself. Well, according to the documentation, people should be doing it this way with these steps. Well, I observed it's that way. And when I spoke to people, it's even another way. Looking at contracts. Okay, in order to provide whatever level of service, your contract states that it should be this, this, and this. Well, I observed that, that, and that. And also any other agreements besides just purely contracts. Also, the results of procedures. So these are different ways of gathering evidence. Now, remember, we talked about earlier that evidence must be relevant. So there's a concept called materiality. Materiality is how significant is this breach, misstatement? Is it very significant? What kind of impact does it have? What is its level of materiality? We're interested in collecting evidence that has materiality to it. And so we're looking for how significant is the error in the procedure, the process, the system, the job function, the organization, because it needs to have some substance to it. Now, evidence, when we collect evidence, it can go through a whole life cycle, and you should be aware of the life cycle. And you should also be aware that evidence needs to be preserved and handled and documented properly, or it may not be admissible if it comes down to going to court. So the first thing with evidence is that we discover and recognize that, hey, this is evidence. We collect it and we protect it. And if it's really material evidence, like if you're looking for like outright fraud and criminal activity, you'll have to follow a whole procedure. It'll have to be bagged and tagged, and two people are there, and there's always a log of who's in possession of it, and it's sealed in a way that it can't be tampered with, etc. So we have to protect it. We have to record the fact that we have it with complete descriptions. We collect it. We identify it. We store and preserve it. The main thing is you want to make sure that nothing happens to the evidence, because if it's been tampered with, then it's no good. As we transport it, we have to make sure that it's securely transported, and there's handoffs with logs and everything. So there's no question, there's no like, well, there were a couple hours we can't account for because the evidence was laying in an open door, in a room with an open door or something. And then we will possibly present the evidence in court, and then we may return it. Now, in the case of computer evidence, one of the things you're going to run into is you may have to confiscate a server. I mean, well, law enforcement will probably do it for you, but there will be cases where this computer is evidence, and people go, I can't function without it. I need this server to do whatever. So it kind of depends. If it's not so criminal, then possibly the evidence you can collect can be a copy of a drive, or it can be a copy of processes or whatever, so that the business can keep on working with the original. Or sometimes it can't be. Sometimes you take the original evidence. So it just kind of depends on how the degree of criminality, we should say. So anyway, the evidence can go through this whole life cycle, and it's up to you to make sure that it is gathered properly, documented properly, preserved properly, not tampered with, and potentially then ultimately returned. Now, the gathering techniques, we talked earlier about gathering techniques. So we can review procedures, we can review documentation, we can review standards. Mostly we're looking at what do you have in place already, what do you have written, anything from contracts to procedures to manuals to what are people really doing. and we'll interview, we'll observe, we'll look at the results. Okay, so you say that you're producing 20,000 widgets a day. How come when they do an inventory there's only 15,000? Now let me go and see why. And it may not be fraud at all. It could just be that now we see in our automated system there's a glitch in the counting mechanism. And so we will interview people and we'll observe. And we'll observe performance, we'll observe procedures and process, and how people conduct their daily work. Now, when we talk about testing, there's two kinds of approaches. There's compliance and substantive. With compliance testing, you're really looking to see, are controls in place, and are they verifying that the controls are there? And so you'll probably do three things. You'll probably first just chat up the person and say, hey, what do you do in your job? Okay. And then you'll see if there are any controls in place, and are they adhering to it? And so you'll just chat, and you'll verify that yes, there are controls in place for people logging on, entering, closing doors, starting up equipment, or whatever. And then once you know that there are controls in place, you can then drill down into that control and see, is that control really working? Is that procedure or counting system or software or hardware or device really doing its job? And that's substantive testing. We're looking to see substantially if that control is functioning as it should be. So we have the two testing methods. Now, evidence can be really reliable and really useful, and it can be just junk. And so the factors that make it more reliable, first of all, how independent is the evidence? Did it come from an independent source? If it comes from someone within the department with an axe to grind, then it's not very independent. But if it came from a third-party vendor who said, yes, I have this, or from another auditor, or from someone who's not involved in that department or that company or that process, the more independent the source, the more reliable the evidence is. Also, what were the qualifications of the person who gave it to you? Like, if I get evidence from a doctor talking about some clinical procedure, to me, that person has much more qualification than somebody who is not a doctor talking, maybe it's an accountant or a plumber talking about a clinical procedure. That person doesn't have the same level of qualification. So what was the level of expertise and qualification of the person who provided it? So did the evidence come from an independent source? That makes it very much more reliable. Did it come from a qualified person with a certain level of expertise? Did they know what they're talking about? Also, how objective is this evidence? And when did this evidence come about? I mean, if this is from 10 years ago, it had better be about a case that's relevant 10 years ago, as opposed to we're trying to find out why this week the production line didn't produce 20,000 widgets. We don't want to look necessarily at 5-year-old data. So we're looking at the independence, the qualification of the person who produced it, the objectivity of it, and also the timeline. Always the chain of evidence. Whenever you collect evidence, there's always got to be a very clear, like I had said before, chain of ownership. There can't be any gaps. Like we can't say, well, we don't know where this evidence sat or who handled it for a 24-hour period. It's got to be very clear that this evidence could not have been tampered with along the way. So a very clear chain of ownership. Now, for common rules of evidence, make sure that the evidence is reliable. Make sure that it is relevant. Make sure it's been well preserved. Make sure that it was properly documented and identified, and of course, is it legally permissible? In the case of computer evidence is considered hearsay because it's so easy to falsify and tamper. Computer evidence can be considered to be corroborating evidence for expert witness testimony. And so you realize that just because I found it on someone's computer, that alone by itself, that could have been placed by somebody. I could have created it. So computer evidence by itself is considered at the same level as hearsay evidence. And at best, it is corroborative evidence for expert witness testimony. In computer forensics, we're trying to find out what happened. Not necessarily even that it was some criminal activity, not always. We're just trying to figure out what on earth happened. Let's look at the software. Where did it break down? Where did the system break down? How did the hackers get in? Where did the network break down? So we're looking for, we're looking at the software, but we also will probably take a look at the system itself. We might even copy the drive. We'll probably even capture the running processes before we just simply unplug the machine, because we want to see what processes are running. We'll also look at the network traffic itself. Let's see what traffic came along on the network. And then at that point, once we've captured it, we'll probably, once we know that we've captured all the running processes, we'll shut down the system then and then preserve it so no one can go in and wipe out the hard drive or tamper with timestamps. So when we do computer forensics, and you have to, if you're going to do this and you're going to take people to court, you have to treat it like a crime scene. You take pictures and you bag it up. Don't do this yourself. Get law enforcement, get somebody who is highly qualified, and because if it's just you doing it, people could cry that it was mishandled and that there wasn't a good chain of ownership. So make sure that you handle computer evidence very, very carefully, and you defer that to someone who, law enforcement or whoever who's qualified. That's, of course, if you're going to court. If you're not going to court and you're just trying to find out what happened, then you're probably best served by copying the drive, looking at running processes, dumping that all out. There are plenty of tools that you can look at on the internet that will do that for you. They'll copy out via a USB port, a serial port, or whatever, to capture the state of the machine as it is at that moment. Now there's this concept called sampling. If we're trying to look at hundreds of thousands of transactions, we can't look at it every one. We just can't. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a sample that's representative of the whole population. And the reason why is because we just don't have the time. Of course, obviously, the larger the sample, the more precise it will be, the more representative it'll be. So when we do sampling, we use a smaller subset of a larger group to get knowledge. We can do statistical sampling where we can say, well, we checked 10% of the total population. We looked at 10% of the transactions and we found X. Or we can do non-statistical. You might say, you know what, I don't need to just across the board look at 10%. I, as an auditor, know that the most likely place will be right there, so I'm just going to go right there. So that's non-statistical. You use your own judgment. Different sampling methods. We can say, okay, just look at 10%, 20%, 5%, whatever, fixed sample size. Or just go until you find something and you don't need to go any farther. We found it, stop and go. We don't need to go any farther. Or discovery. Look a lot deeper because there might be some very small instances of fraud. They might fall under your normal radar, but look really deeply. Or we might do something called a variable method. Don't just look at all the population. Look at the thing created by the night shift versus the things created by the day shift, where you stratify. You look at a smaller subset and then you evaluate those smaller subsets. Or you could just say, no, everything that was created by all shifts last week. Or you can look at the difference. You can say, okay, unaudited, supposedly 20,000 widgets came out. But when I did the audit, only 15,000 widgets came out. So you look at that difference. So these are all different ways of going about doing sampling. So when you collect your samples, obviously you establish the objectives. You decide what is the population, in other words, the thing you're sampling. What is our method? We talked about them earlier. How big is the sample size? We'll do 10%, random. We'll then select our audit sample. We'll do the audit, and then we'll evaluate the results. So that is how we gather evidence. The next thing is, what do we do once we have all of these results?